The only thing we can be sure of about the future is that it will be absolutely fantastic.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Hello, and welcome to Into the Impossible, a podcast about how we imagine and how what we imagine shapes what we do, from the Arthur C. Clarke Center for Human Imagination at UC San Diego. I'm Patrick Coleman, and today we were going to explore how we imagine climate change, but we've had to put that off for next month. Instead, we're digging into our vaults to bring you a little food for thought about fact versus fiction in Alien Contact, and what fiction, and one of the leading living practitioners of the form, can do to help us think about the very alien-ness of alien contact and how it may be happening all around us. So let's start with Contact. And by that I mean the film Contact, to lay out the odds.
Yeah, there are 400 billion stars out there just in our galaxy alone. If only one out of a million of those had planets. All right, and if just one out of a million of those had life, and if just one out of a million of those had intelligent life, there would be literally millions of civilizations out there.
Well, if there wasn't, it'd be an awful waste of space.
Except, no.
It turns out that scriptwriters can't do math.
There's a problem there, and Jill Tarter, the chair at the SETI Institute, that's the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, and the real-life basis for Jodie Foster's character in Carl Sagan's novel and the film that adapted it, was here a few years ago to tell us about it.
And this is a slightly sad story. Carl Sagan died in December of 96. The movie came out in June of 97. In December of 96, it was even longer than it is on the screen now. Warner Brothers was still cutting the movie. But Ann Druyan wanted to bring a clip to a memorial service that we had for Carl at JPL. And the clip that she brought was this one that we've just seen, because it preceded the first kiss, sort of the romantic anchor for the film. And so whatever else they cut, Warner Brothers knew they weren't going to cut this. And so Annie came with this clip. And you may remember Jodie Foster's looking up right there they're up by the visitor center at Arecibo and looking at the sky. 400 billion stars in the sky. Well, if only 1 in a million of those stars had planets, and if only 1 in a million of those planets had life, and if only 1 in a million of those life stars turned into intelligent creatures, there would be millions of civilizations. Okay, you do the math. It's 10 to the 11 times 10 to the minus 18. It's not equal to 10 to the 6, not by 13 orders of magnitude. So, as Anne shows this clip to a room full of scientists and engineers, there is this collective kind of gasp. And you think, oh God, Carl must be rolling over. So there was a reception afterwards, and Jodie was there, and Zemeckis and the folks. And so I went up and I said, Jodie, it's wrong. Got to change it. She brought over the screenwriter, and he was wringing his hands. He said, oh, I worked so hard. I was sure I got it right.
So if that's not correct, what are the odds? Scientists use something called the Drake equation, named after its creator, astronomer Frank Drake, who came up with it in 1961. The Drake equation uses estimates, assumptions, and variables to estimate the number of civilizations in the known universe that might be capable of communicating with us. It includes things like the number of stable stars, the number of stars that may have planetary systems, the number of those planets that might be habitable, and of those, what fraction might actually harbor life, and of those, which evolve life intelligent enough to reach out to the cosmos through some kind of signaling, and the quirky L term of the equation, which is the length of time that these theoretical alien civilizations continue to transmit those signals into space. Originally posed as the period of time after the aliens discover atomic energy and up to the moment they blow their entire civilization to smithereens. You solve for n, and you get the number of civilizations that might be out there. Seth Shostak, senior astronomer of SETI, says we'll find intelligence in the next 20 years. But the variables and estimates are highly changeable and subject to dispute. Even since Contact was filmed, what astronomers know about the universe has shifted radically, as Tarter herself pointed out.
Well, I think there have been two major changes since the movie, certainly since the book and since the movie was filmed in 95 and 96. And those changes are extremophiles and exoplanets, right? Both of which were just beginning to be appreciated. At that time, we knew about two tiny little planets that orbited a pulsar, a burned out star, not likely to have anything to do with life. And we were just beginning to see 51 Pegasus and the first group of hot Jupiter planets. And it was oh my God, it's not like our solar system. And of course, all of the computer simulations that we'd been doing before that always came out with nice flat systems, nice circular orbits, the little guys, rocky guys inside, the big gas giants outside. And the first planet we find around a normal star is a Jupiter within a 4.3 day period, right? There you go. N equals 1 is a really scary place to make predictions from, right? So now that we've got thousands of exoplanets, we are really beginning to learn something about how planetary systems form. And we still haven't found Earth 2.0. That's going to be in the future, I'm pretty confident. And the idea about extremophiles, organisms, and not just microscopic organisms, but great big tube worms and blind shrimp and other kinds of creatures that can live in environments that would be hostile to you and I, but for which they are perfectly, beautifully evolved, means that there's probably a lot more potentially habitable real estate out there than we once thought.
I've got no chains, they shocked and paralyzed me. Aliens took my baby away.
Some of our own astrophysicists are part of identifying these new exoplanets. See episode 7 of this podcast for an interview with Adam Bergasser, who was part of the team that discovered TRAPPIST-1. And in doing so, they expand the horizon for our imagination and how we imagine intelligence and life outside of our own frame of reference. In the film Contact, when Ellie, the protagonist, finally meets an alien, it takes the form of her dead father. In the film, it's sweet, reassuring, with shades of a benign afterlife. But traveling across the galaxy to come face to face with your long-dead dad could just as easily be macabre or uncanny, and yet also an all-too-familiar example of how, when trying to conceive of encountering alien life, our imagination struggles to go very far. In this case, not even beyond the nuclear family. To further expand our sense of what constitutes life and environment, to look critically at the assumptions not even encoded in Drake's equation, I want to turn to the speculative fiction writer who the New Yorker described as the weird Thoreau, Jeff VanderMeer.
I should note
That's Jeff.
that when I read that in the New Yorker, my first thought was Thoreau was the weird Thoreau.
In VanderMeer's fiction, like the much-lauded Southern Reach trilogy, adapted for screen this month in the film Annihilation, starring Natalie Portman, and the novel Born, life takes on new, unsettling, defamiliarizing, and destabilizing forms. He is taught in the Clarion Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers Workshop that we organize each summer, and joined us a couple years ago to provide a keynote to a course series we collaborated on called Are We Alone?, which brought together faculty in literature, media studies, art, and science to generate new, expansive, and speculative possibilities for what we look for in contact with the alien.
Are we alone? Originally, I was just going to say yes and leave the stage. Are we alone? No, yes, maybe. There are so many possible entry points to this question, as I think you've seen today. But given where we are right now, why not start with something written by Arthur C. Clarke himself? Perhaps not The Sentinel, though, but instead The Star. For anyone unfamiliar with Clarke's The Star, it tells the story of an expedition that encounters the ruins of an alien civilization whose star supernovaed, killing them all. In the twist at the end, the expedition discovers that the light from that supernova reached Earth around 0 AD, manifesting as the star seen over Bethlehem in the Christian Bible. Now, the star is powerful not just because of the juxtaposition of life and death and rebirth, but also because it is merciless in interrogating human ideas of meaning about the universe. Some readers take the story as a critique of organized religion, but I find that it's more complex and empathetic than that. It's telling that the priest narrator points out Jesuit contributions to the sciences, and that scientists on board the spaceship dismiss the priest, despite his bona fides. Whether intended by Clarke or not, there is a subtle indictment of that dismissal, that lack of an attempt to understand another's point of view. The Star is very much about the human need to create story out of what we observe around us, to in any context and by whatever means make sense of the unknown or the unknowable. This need is so great that it can often be found at work in the backdrop of even so-called serious and empirical scientific endeavor, creating fiction out of reality, perhaps. The Star is also subverting to some extent a common science fictional theme, the desire to reach beyond, to go farther, to experience more. The expedition in The Star and their spacecraft could be said to be the physicality of a thought expressed first in the imagination and then made manifest, creating reality out of fiction. Sometimes this thought first occurs in the form of a simple question. Sometimes the answer is perilous. Sometimes the question answered is not the question you asked. Are we alone? Who are we and thus who are they, which we and which they? Are we not alone if we find microorganisms on Mars, or is that somehow anticlimactic? I think we know the answer. Are we not alone if we find a random mammal contentedly munching on some form of vegetation on a planet orbiting a distant star? Or are we only not alone if we find some form of life we deem truly intelligent? Or intelligent and relatable in the sense that we as humans recognize in this intelligent life form traits we ourselves possess? Even if they had not been so disturbingly human, we could not have helped admiring them, the priest in The Star writes. At what point is the switch flipped from alone to not alone? Would a satisfactory answer differ for the alien we might someday meet? Would the very idea of the question mean something radically different? Clearly, for human beings, the question wasn't answered at the point at which we realized the sky was full of stars and that they did not revolve around the Earth. The question at that point, complicated by the fact that some of us did not want the answer, killed or imprisoned those who began to suggest its outline. Nor was the question answered, nor did it become a different question when we trained powerful telescopes on those stars and began to discover the planets that orbit them. So there is an insatiability at the heart of the question that speaks to a need for meaning through connection with some recognizable other that made me think immediately, are we just trying to avoid some other question? What would replace the question if we ever answered it in the affirmative? We're not alone, this giant Pynchon-esque amoeba thing just spoke to us. Okay, so we're not alone. Now can we be not alone, harder, badder, better, more? I'm not sure, because I'm not sure how delinked the question that's been asked is from rationalizations that continue the drive for limitless expansion, how much in lockstep it marches with some other impulse. I would hope that are we alone isn't just the booster rocket for manifest destiny transformed. I'd hope that it's also, or instead, an expression of a genuine empathy and desire for discovery, a genuine reaching out. Yet even empathy, like a telescope, can be directed on one place and ignore another entirely. And discovery for human beings has rarely meant anything as selfless as quenching a desire for contact and for pure knowledge. The famous sense of wonder in science fiction has often been achieved by ignoring flawed assumptions or simplifications embedded in the foundations of the story In tales of first contact, we have sometimes conveniently forgotten the tragedy and genocide of first contact between different groups of humans on Earth. A question then, by asking us to look outward, can carry with it perilous assumptions about our place in the universe and our place on Earth. This looking out, the searching of the wider expanse beyond our own planet, whether fact-born or fiction-born, is in some sense equally speculative. The idea of a confluence between science and fiction interesting because an argument could be made that it has historical underpinnings. It's useful to remember, if thinking about interdisciplinary approaches, that early scientific papers took the form of philosophical tales in which a fictional framework surrounded some sort of scientific experiment or speculation. And it may only be news to me, but I recently read that in the late 1800s, some scientists presented their findings in the form of poetry. If the boundary between fact and fiction is at times porous, if its delivery systems sometimes resemble each other, it's certainly so in talking about extraterrestrial life. The truth is, when we finally do encounter intelligent alien life, it's more than likely that almost all of our scientific and fictional speculation will be rendered in some way obsolete, that everything you've read on the subject will be like the supposed canals on Mars in fiction from days of yore, or the jetpack future of the 1950s we were all promised. Added to this is the constant dilemma of the human condition, which is its subjectivity. So that even a seemingly simple concept like scientific accuracy can become unmoored in unexpected ways. Often in looking outward, we are receiving back what we want to perceive. Therefore, any methodology applied to the subject of aliens must be aware of the limitations of the human gaze. Part of the problem is the obvious one: we have only these 5 senses, and no matter how we augment those senses with our technology, it is still hard for our imaginations to extrapolate beyond those senses. We see this daily in how we continue to stand behind self-destructive policies because some of the consequences are hidden from our direct view or occur in a realm invisible to us. Nor is this lack a problem for the layperson only. Dedicated scientists experience it as well. Our brains also constantly work to convert the world into metaphors and similes, into comparisons that help us to navigate our way through life. Some of this is instinctual, some specific to culture. In trying to reach beyond, our limitation is that if we're not diligent and on guard, our conceptualizations default to the wrong things. A recent example of this limitation comes directly from SETI. In a New York op-ed piece by the director for the Center of SETI Research at the SETI Institute, in talking about the risk of proactively sending out signals that might be picked up by a hostile presence, he speculates about how aliens might perceive the injustices we've perpetrated on one another. And I quote, "Personally, I think this concern is overwrought. Any society that can pick up our radio messages will be at a level of development at least centuries beyond our own. They would be no more incensed by our bad behavior than historians who learned that Babylonians attacked one another with spears." I'll let that sink in for a second. No more incensed than historians who learned that Babylonians attacked one another with spears. What belief is he invoking? What leap of faith? Faith does not have to include a star in the heavens. We will always supply the star regardless. Perhaps he is trying to be relatable for a general audience. But even so, if the director of SETI conceptualizes aliens in such a limited way, it exposes a possible flaw at the heart of our endeavors. I would also argue that the comparison is meaningless, that the words have no meaning at the coordinates that they have been given. But it also means that your studies the past few weeks can lead to something not just productive, tangible, but perhaps also unique, because even the head of SETI can sound unimaginative. It's important not to over-deify scientists and scientific organizations in general, especially in areas that require rather more speculation than others, especially given the fact scientists need to have the freedom to fall on their faces like everybody else. So I say with not too much judgment that the same day I read the editorial, I encountered an article about a professor from the University of Barcelona who had used statistics and some generalizations about Earth's countries and biosphere to conclude that it's most likely we will next encounter a planet of about 50 million bear-sized aliens. With rather more judgment, I can tell you that on that same day, I also listened to the great Freeman Dyson on NPR saying that global warming is not a big deal, along with other ignorant things. And that I read an article on how gender bias among scientists led to the assumption that the planet represented by the human egg played a passive role in relation to the expedition known as sperm, an assumption now known to be at best incomplete, at worst wrong. So if as a writer I self-identify as an absurdist, it is to remind myself that the world often only forms a coherent narrative because we impose that narrative upon it. If I want to always try to be aware of the irrational behavior of human beings and of human institutions, it is to, as a novelist, not operate from the same old defaults. A constraint was put on the question, "Are we alone?" by SETI, in its decision to monitor radio waves and focus mostly on a certain range of radio waves. A default assumption was made because it had to be made, because sometimes science is just a best guess. One imagines some alien culture with its own version of SETI, based on a completely different set of assumptions. Both come up empty, never the twain shall meet. What then does it mean to be alone or not alone? If you are alone, are you by definition lonely, with the yearning that implies? What does yearning or desire do to warp the results of an inquiry? And wouldn't it be reasonable to assume, and maybe it's not, that many forms of alien intelligent life out in the cosmos do not suffer a similar angst about being alone? And is our angst about it healthy or somewhat unhealthy? In such a context, the role of fiction can be very valuable. I'm reminded of the mind-blowing stories of R.A. Lafferty, which do not strive for realism, but in their surreal approach are perhaps more useful than hard science fiction in expanding possibilities about alien life. In one of Lafferty's tales, an expedition discovers that the intelligent aliens on the planet they're exploring are matriarchal, and that every female member of this alien species is still alive. In a remarkable scene, the protagonist passes through ever smaller subterranean caverns to meet the original alien matriarch. Is this a plausible scenario? No, but in the way it warps your mind and makes you think differently, it definitely trumps and is, I would argue, more useful than a prediction of bear-sized aliens or comparisons to the ancient Babylonians. In another Lafferty story, Thieving Bear Planet, which I highly recommend, the aliens are portrayed as capricious and erratic because their ultimate motivations cannot be grokked by human beings. If you don't know what grokked means, I'll explain later. The human expedition encounters weird gaps in time, small replicas of themselves, and hauntings that only make sense as part of an alien methodology. Lafferty's genius is to show only glimpses of that methodology, thus giving us a true sense of what alien contact might be like. One last example, this time from a Soviet writer, Dmitry Belinkin, a story called Crossing of the Paths. In his story, he describes an encounter on a distant planet between a human expedition in a vehicle sent out from a spaceship and an alien species known as the Manger. The Manger looks like a huge thicket of bushes across a hillside. In fact, it's an intelligent collective, and it's nomadic to avoid giant electrical storms. The humans in their crawler try to drive right through the Manger, but become trapped because of a series of mistakes based on the standard assumptions one might make about the Earth version of a thicket of bushes. During what follows, the crew never fully figures out that they've encountered intelligent alien life because the aims of the humans and the aliens are so different. Nor did the aliens recognize that they've encountered intelligent life either. Nor, in their alien context, would they care if they did. Each reacts as to their nature and their precepts, and each is thus unaware of one another. A circle looks at a square and sees a badly made circle. Recognition, then. Recognition is an essential step in asking the question, are we alone? Recognition of intent, perhaps. Recognition of something not ourselves, not acting like ourselves, that yet has some form of spark, of sentience. If our own recognition of intelligence is incomplete, how do we know that we constitute the kind of intelligence that another intelligence might recognize? In other words, do we fulfill the very requirements we ask of others? Frankly, I'm not sure that we have proven that we can recognize intelligence when we encounter it. I would argue that almost all of our cultures, societies, our national identities, and our day-to-day habits tell us that we have not completed this task fully. It may be true that some of us exist more in harmony with our surroundings and leave less of a mess for the earth to deal with, but that's a different issue. The fact is, for a long time we have denied that intelligence exists all around us. In recent campaigns to grant personhood to apes, dolphins, and other species, we see the beginnings of the recognition that we have never been alone. If we haven't been able to see this before, it's perhaps understandable, especially if we're not as aware as we think. Today's world contains so many examples on a daily basis of casual cruelty and thoughtlessness, codified as practicality or reasonable behavior, or even in the worst examples, a twisted kind of empathy regarding aspects of the environment and the animals that populate that environment. These unexamined assumptions become agitprop for status quo. Perhaps as a kind of slurry or runoff from these trends, our online experience is full of animals pushing slogans of universal truth or some humorous saying, wise owls, otter nonsense, smiling dolphins, because we love animals. We truly love animals. We usually love them as long as they're funny or cute or in some other way reduced down to a meme. We breathe life into them using carelessly corrosive received ideas, each iteration farther from any kind of true seeing. Even worse are images like a popular cute one of an otter in a small glass cage at a zoo that was shared by like 1 million people. Holes in the cage allow people to shake hands with the otter. This image, again, has been shared and reshared with seemingly little realization that if it showed a human being in a glass cage trained to shake hands with visitors, no one would be calling it cute. This is all incredibly relevant to our current crises and the mindsets behind them. But it is also relevant to our search for alien life and our expectations and assumptions about that life, recognition. Because ultimately we will find that aliens always lived amongst us. Because this may help us to understand more clearly that ideas like manifest destiny that still permeate our society, sublimated in a devotion to unsustainable and endless growth, and yes, sometimes a reaching for the stars, also pertain to how we treat the aliens amongst us.
Our planet may be doomed, our Earth devastated, the monsters are in revolt, and civilization is in chaos.
Hey, Tommy, get out the window.
Understanding animal intelligence may be key to understanding our own as well. Philosopher Timothy Morton, in his essay Human Thought at Earth Magnitude, published earlier this year, makes a compelling argument for studying the imagination of bees and ants as comparable in some ways to the human imagination. That decisions are made that we have for a long time put in the category of requiring conscious thought that may not be. That given confirmation bias, we can no longer be certain human imagination is not itself full of series of set operating protocols and automated systems. Study in this area may mean that humans have less free will than previously thought. Speculating about the imagination of bees seems at the very least to be a useful thought experiment because our systems created by the human imagination have proven largely useless in the face of ecological devastation and the reduction of the total animal biomass by almost 50% since 1970. Why not try to better understand what it means to be an animal and in what ways we are primitive by comparison? The major reevaluation or rethinking we need to accomplish is to finally admit the true complexity and importance of animal life, not just some anthropomorphic and patronizing sympathy, and in the process continue the necessary step of decentralizing the human experience. To become more, we must become less. To answer the question, are we alone? We must be receptive enough and humble enough to actually see what is around us on this planet. Perhaps, too, if we had paid more attention to the localized answer to are we alone, we would already have cities that take as inspiration the complex ecosystems found at the top of redwoods. Maybe we'd be able to see that a smartphone is fairly crude next to the ways plants communicate with one another through fungal thoroughfares, that the symbiotic relationship between the albatross and the sunfish reveals startling and unexpected complexity. In such a context, I don't think I'm a Luddite to wonder if we're not often using primitive modern tech like smartphones and Google Glass to build an inaccurate prism of the world around us, one that walls out not being alone with shiny reflective surfaces and fragmentation of our attention spans. Relatedly, the kind of sci-fi that I think is coming closer and closer to extinction is the kind that does not as often admit to the complexity and irrationality of living organisms and their relationships, but instead privileges the primacy of things. This isn't at all to say that modern technology can't engage in a meaningful way with these issues. It is all the time, and it is incredibly useful to scientists. In a variety of fields, specialists have begun to invest our human world with products that mimic the best of animal efficiencies and complexities, regardless of the issue of consciousness. On the whole, this mimicry creates something both more balanced and more intricate than what came before. But much of our everyday tech, the systems that shape our thoughts and thus our consciousness, come with an underlying assumption that the creators of seamless tech are themselves logical and forward-thinking, and thus the products are. If you want another view, a very dystopian one, read the article Come With Us If You Want to Live Among the Apocalyptic Libertarians of Silicon Valley in the January 2015 issue of Harper's Magazine. It's a real eye-opener. There you will find manifestations of the absurd that will make you wonder what an intelligent alien from another planet would think of our intelligence. From cryogenics to things far more outlandish, disguised as a commitment to the new enlightenment. You will also find odd statements like AI is so much more complicated than natural ecosystems. Yet as far as I know, human beings have never created a complex natural ecosystem from scratch. A friend, Skylar Nelson, works for an AI company, and he sees this point of view among tech elites as a barrier to advances in his field. I quote him here at length because what he says is so relevant to this topic. The funny thing is that we'll go out of our way to attribute agency to things. We'll ascribe a purpose to any movement we think we can discern a pattern in, and we're overzealous pattern recognizers. We'll infamously become totally convinced of patterns where none exist. But we have this extremely overspecific anthropomorphic concept of intelligence that we're hesitant to apply. We don't recognize other forms of intelligent behavior in animals, and we're unfortunately hesitant to even see intelligence in the behavior of people who differ from us significantly. And the really funny thing is, of course, that the sort of logical, sequential reasoning that many of us take to be the hallmark feature of intelligence is something that we humans rarely actually do. There's an increasing amount of evidence from the neurosciences that most of our decision-making processes occur at the instinctual level and are sort of retroactively justified by reasoning processes when necessary. What is intelligence? If we're still figuring that out, and if the distance between, say, a bee and a human becomes shortened and lessened, then it's likely our quest to answer the question, are we alone, will change radically in the next century. All of this hopefully chips away at the fallacy that we have already discovered everything about this world we live on, which gives most the idea that somehow we have more positive control over our environment than we do. All of this hopefully would get us closer to being better prepared if at some point in the future the question of, are we alone, is answered in the affirmative by visitors from some distant planet. All of this makes less likely that when that day occurs, we bring with us all the old baggage, all the old assumptions, all the useless things we don't need and haven't needed for a long time. In the end, to answer the question, are we alone, we cannot look outward without a better awareness of our surroundings on Earth and without looking inward. To be complex in our thinking, but clear in our expression, to not reduce down to binaries or generalities, but not get lost in the details either. What will we encounter out there but ecosystems? What will life be but different? To think in positive terms about our human systems, about our tech, perhaps repurposings can help us too. Imagine what could be accomplished in seeing the miraculous in the everyday if someone invested in a virtual reality experience that started with biologists and chemists and environmental scientists and a host of other experts in various fields, coming to your neighborhood to pre-map the world beyond the world. Afterwards, you'd put on the device and walk down your street. Everything would be identical to what you'd see with your own eyes, except you'd also see the chemical signals in the air from beetles and plants, pheromone trails laid down by ants, and every other bit of the natural world's communications currently invisible to our primitive five senses. You'd also see every trace of pesticide and runoff and carcinogens and every other human-made intercession on the landscape. It would be overwhelming at first. But once you got used to it, more advanced settings might be possible. You'd look at the ground and it would open up its layers past topsoil and earthworms down into the deeper epidermis, so to speak, until you're overcoming a sense of vertigo because even though you're standing right there, not falling at all, below you everything is revealing itself to you super fast. And maybe then, while still staring at the ground, you'd have an option to regress to simulations of the same spot, 5 years, 10 years, 50 years, 200 years ago, until when you look up again, there's no street at all, and you're in the middle of a forest, and there are more birds and animals than you could ever imagine, because you've never seen that many in one place. You've never even seen this many old-growth trees before. You've never known that the world was once like this, except in the abstract. You're in fact standing on an alien planet. And once you got used to that, maybe then, only then, you'd be able to play the game at a level in which you inhabit the consciousness of an animal. Something less advanced at first, like a tortoise or a squirrel, and then work your way up to something fairly intelligent, like a wild boar or a raccoon. And once you'd worked your way up to human, or sideways to human, or down to human, whatever that looks like, then and only then would you be allowed to look at the stars, to imagine the cosmos, and to encounter the alien life that might exist there. If enough people played that game right and understood what it meant, you, your children, your grandchildren, and your great-grandchildren might live long lives, and everyone would continue to be able to have things like electricity, which makes using virtual devices a lot easier. Otherwise, to any alien spying on us right now, it might seem just like a dead helmet sitting atop a head full of rotted meat. As should be clear, the approach to answering this fundamental question seems to me to be inherently interdisciplinary. Just as we more and more see the world as a series of intimately intertwined and interlocking living systems, so too we need to encourage any impulse that creates cross-pollination. Scientists don't have a monopoly on extrapolation. Philosophers and artists and musicians have much to contribute. Fiction writers, video game designers. The serious question for storytellers becomes, is science fiction up to this challenge? Or is mainstream contemporary fiction, certain strands of which have less of an issue with loose ends and tend to generate plot through close observation of characters, an approach that may be more suitable to capturing this moment and the next? And in that case, is poetry perhaps more aligned to what I've been reading in philosophy, more attuned to the subtlety required to meet the challenge of reflecting, refracting, and projecting, internalizing the necessary sedimentary layers? If extrapolation is by definition a very human logic, is it too limiting as a method of exploration? Does that logic get it wrong? Does it conflate the wrong things, put into contact too small a set of variables, want the wrong things, empower the wrong things, the wrong actors in the wrong context? I don't know the answers, and I know that some questions asked are always more useful if they remain questions. I just know that thinking about them, especially in an interdisciplinary way, can be incredibly empowering. Engaging with this subject may not always be easy, but it can be liberating, and it is possible to find within what is serious and what requires critique those moments too of joy and moments of beauty. Are we alone? We will be soon if we don't change our ways. Despite pockets of enlightenment, we often act as if we're settlers on an alien planet, destroying and changing much that we don't even recognize as important. But we don't live on an alien planet. We have no home world to go back to if things fail here. We were born here and we will die here, no matter how many new planets astronomers discover. This is the place we must pay attention to and we learn how to live in, to find a good answer to the question of what we contribute to the global biosphere. In the end, then, we are still on an expedition in the middle of the unknown, on a wondrous and complex planet that we are only beginning to understand, that manifests in beautifully interconnected ways, even in a patch of weeds springing out from a piece of cracked pavement. And we are, as ever, in existence in the moment and no more. This is where we've always been, even if we haven't always realized it. We can never totally discard the human gaze because we are human, but we can imagine our way past it. And fully living within and thinking deeply about a question like, are we alone, is an important part of that experience.
This has been Into the Impossible, a podcast of the Arthur C. Clarke Center for Human Imagination at UC San Diego. We'd like to thank Jill Tarter and Jeff VanderMeer for being our guests, and acknowledge our generous patrons, including Viasat Inc., members of the Founders Orbit, Sue and Steve Hart, and the James B. Axe Family Foundation. To find out more about the Clarke Center and our other exciting projects, research, and programs, as well as how to support our mission, please visit imagination.ucsd.edu. Live audio production by the Qualcomm Institute. Audio production of this episode by me, Patrick Coleman. Produced by Patrick Coleman and Sheldon Brown. If you've been enjoying the show, please share it with your friends. Leave us a review. 5 stars is always nice. We appreciate your time. And we hope you join us next month when we look at how we imagine climate change. Thanks.
The only thing we can be sure of about the future is that it will be absolutely fantastic.
5, 4,